we have the privilege of hearing from Eric Thompson. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of introduction, a little background on our colleague here, and introduce you to his talk, and then he'll take over. Sure. I thought I was loud, so sorry. How's that? Thank you. Okay. So, to introduce Eric, Eric Thompson is an instructor of religion and Hebrew and discipline coordinator for the Religious Studies program at SRJC. He has several degrees in biblical scholarship and theology. He spent several years as a Calvinist, studied the Westminster Catechism extensively, taught Hebrew and Greek to Presbyterian ministerial students, and was himself a candidate for ordination. His talk today is called The River of God's Grace, Scottish Presbyterian Calvinism Runs Through It. And he's going to be picking up on the many references in the novel to the culture and theology of Scottish Calvinist Christianity. Eric will explain what the river means in relationship to the human characters. He will argue that theology, the central term grace, about the central term of grace, which has a special meaning in the Calvinist tradition. So, warm welcome to Eric Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Hello. How many? Oh, I'm starting now. All right. You gonna aim this over here? I guess I should. I'll try to stay over here then. I've got a mobile and I've got PowerPoint with effects. So, and I have props. I think I'll go and get my props and bring them into the light. Hang on. So, how many of you here have read A River Runs Through It? Okay, there are a few of you, more than half. Yes? Okay, so, and if you haven't read the book or seen the movie, how many of you have seen the movie? Okay. So, I'm addressing that book, and what I have to say is about the background underlying the book, and you will, if you don't know the text, the book itself, the novella, then you can go and read it later on, and you will read it with a more informed point of view. How is that? How does that sound? So on the first page of the book, I just want to kind of show you a couple of props that I'm going to be talking about. If you don't know this particular kind of Christianity, there are a lot of things that you might miss or even misread in the novella. It references to the particular kind of Christianity that we're talking about, that the family is about in the novella. I'll just call it a novel for short because it's easier to say. They are Scottish, they're Presbyterian, and they're Calvinists, and those mean very specific things, which I'm going to explain in detail. And then I'm going to give a reading from somebody who knows that theology and that particular religious cultural tradition, what strikes me as what Norman MacLean is doing when he uses the river as his central metaphor, and what the human characters, particularly Paul, the brother who dies, is representing theologically. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to use as a way of explicating the theology for you the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which is this document right here. It's quoted, the very first part of the catechism is quoted on page 1 of the novel. And I'll explain what this is, and I will also use this to, like I said, as a through line to explicate the things that I'm going to say. I also brought my Greek New Testament, one of many I have. You notice if you've read the book, you notice that the father is a pastor. He's a minister in the Presbyterian church, and he carries around one of these when he goes fishing. This is the book that he is reading on the bank when he goes fishing at the end of the book with his sons. And so I'm going to, you can, after I talk for about maybe 40 minutes, and I'm going to leave time for questions that you might have, and we can have a discussion. And if you feel impelled to, you can come up here and touch this. It might, I don't know, do something for you. But this is the kind of book that someone in that condition, someone with that training and with that vocation would have studied, would have known very well. Seminary training that the father would have undergone would have involved typically 2 years of Greek, which maybe isn't quite enough to master, but he would have known Greek relatively well. And so this is the book that is referred to, and I'll also talk about the passage that they referred to, and that in fact the novel ends with. The very last paragraph of the novel is a reference to a particular biblical passage. So, without further ado, I will take you down the river. That's my title. And here's my points. So, Presbyterian Calvinism. Jean Calvin, for whom Calvinism is named, is a monumentally important figure in the history of Christianity in general. John Calvin was French, a French dude, and those were his dates, 1509 to 1564. John Calvin was a little later than Martin Luther, but John Calvin was inspired by the movement that Martin Luther started, Protestantism, right? Some of you probably have had a little bit of education in that, maybe at classes here. And so Calvin, there's a picture of him. He was a French follower of Martin Luther, and he fled from France to Geneva. The French, you may realize this, that the French resisted the Protestant Reformation, and they remained Catholic in face of, against the Protestant Reformation. And so Calvin was basically driven out of town. And Calvin was a particularly annoying Protestant. And so they drove him out of town, and he ended up setting up a Christian commune of sorts in Geneva, Switzerland, and had his own little Reformed society. Calvin's program, his theology, his worldview, and the systematic ideology that he developed is called Reformed theology. That's its name. And he wrote the systematic theology of the Reformation, which is a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And then the other person, the historical figure in this equation, is John Knox. John Knox was a Scotsman who was a follower of Calvin, an admirer of Calvin. He converted to Calvin's brand of Protestant Christianity and tried to establish it in Scotland. He was driven out. He fled first to Germany and then later came to England and then went back to Scotland to start what is now called the Presbyterian Church. That's John Knox. There are a lot of Presbyterian churches around. It's something that's probably generally familiar to people. Some of you may even, be Presbyterians. There's a Presbyterian church down the road. Presbyterianism, the Presbyterian Church, is a pretty well-known denomination in the United States. I'm going to say some things about its roots, and if you are Presbyterian, I'll just give a little caveat, or if you know someone who's a Presbyterian, most of what I have to say, a Presbyterian today in 2014, almost 2015, wouldn't recognize, because religions constantly change. And so the Calvinism that is the fundamental basis, the fundamental foundation for the Presbyterian Church and its brand of Christian religion has softened over time, over hundreds of years, has grown to be a shadow and relic of its former self. So I'm going to give you the stuff that the original founders were on about, and I always find, I say this because when I teach this in my classes, I always find that people who are Christians, who are of this particular persuasion, who are Protestants, maybe even Presbyterians, don't recognize what I'm about to describe in their own worldview and their own faith at all. And sometimes it's a little disconcerting for them to hear this, that this is the foundation idea. And so I just want to prepare you for that. John Knox founded the Presbyterian Church, and he helped create the Westminster Catechism, which is the document that's quoted in the novel, which I'm going to give you several quotes from. And so, just to finish this up, Calvin wrote The Institutes of the Christian Religion is his book, where he lays out his systematic theology. It is the charter for Reformed theology. And Knox was an architect of Presbyterian polity. Now, these are the two aspects of the same religious system. Calvin was the author. I'm sorry, I'm going hog wild with the pointer. I don't get to use pointers very often, so it's a kind of a fun toy for me. Calvin is the architect of the ideology, of the theology of God, what God is like and what it's like to relate to God, and what the grace of God means. Grace of God, and you notice if you've read the novel, you notice that that's a key word that is used throughout, and I'm going to explain what I think that the author, who comes from this culture, means by it. And I think that what I'm going to tell you is something that would have been very strongly in his background. What the Presbyterian Church is named for is for its polity, that is, its political structure. So Reformed theology refers to the doctrines of Calvin, which most especially involve the doctrine of predestination and providence, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Presbyterian polity refers to the governmental structure of how the church operates, which goes like this. Presbyterian polity is a governmental structure in which the congregation, the people, elect representatives to govern the church as a board of elders. That's what the word Presbyterian means. It comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means old man in Greek. That's what it means, old man. So a Presbyterian is a church of rule by the old men. Yes. So and so it's a representative democracy, so that the people don't vote directly. The people elect representatives who rule directly. And the pastor, the minister, the person who does the preaching, the person who is kind of the spiritual leader of the church, is hired by the board of elders, or in the Presbyterian Church called the presbytery. And so you may recognize, if you've had any civics, any government classes, you may recognize this. In the United States government is modeled on the Presbyterian model, in point of fact, right? And all of this comes from Knox and Scotland. Now, like that effect? Do you feel like you're in a river? Blub, blub, blub. Feel like you're fly fishing? The Westminster Confession of Faith, this document that is referred to in the novel, was written in 1646 and 7 by a synod, which is to say a committee, right, of English and Scottish theologians. Here you have theologians from Scotland and England getting together, hobnobbing, having a powwow. I'm sorry about that word, powwow. This synod means a powwow of a sort. And they wanted to unify. They wanted the churches, the new churches of England and Scotland. In England, you have a new church founded in the mid-1500s by Henry VIII, the Church of England, and then John Knox's Presbyterian Church in Scotland, and they wanted them to be on the same page. And so the document known as the Westminster Catechism was a document that was collaboratively formed by representatives of these different churches that were newly formed churches in the Protestant Reformation, so that everybody could have the same faith. Everybody could agree on the same basic ideas of what their Christianity meant to them. And so the catechism, it's called a catechism. A catechism is a teaching tool. And it's a catechism in this context is in the form of questions and answers. So the Westminster Catechism starts with this statement. Page 1, you open it up, the first thing it says is it has Q1, question 1. What is the chief end of man? If you read the book, you recognize this. It's quoted on the very first page. What is the chief end of man? And then it gives you the answer. It doesn't leave you to answer the question yourself. It gives you the answer, right? That's what catechism is all about. And the answer is sorry about the generic use of man. I never use it that way myself, but only in quotes. They use it. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's the answer, right? And this is the first statement in the Shorter Catechism, which is a document of 107 such questions and answers. That's what it is. I have a whole copy of it here, and I just want you to appreciate how little it is. Right? This is the thing. This contains, from the point of view of these Presbyterian Scottish Calvinists that I'm talking about, for their point of view, this embodies Christianity. This is all the essentials, everything you need to know. This states in clear language, unlike the Bible, by the way, because the Bible's just not that clear. This states in clear language what a true Christian is supposed to believe and how they're also supposed to live. All right? And so it also answers with scriptural proofs. And there's a picture of the original title page, printed in London in 1647. That's going to go there. That ripple effect is going to be there for every slide. So if it makes you dizzy, just a warning. So Calvinism, I want to foreground 3 basic points that are essential, the essential ingredients of Calvinism. And they are the doctrine of providence, the doctrine of salvation, also known in fancy theological jargon as soteriology. Soteriology is the doctrine of salvation. And the ethos, that is the ethic, how you're supposed to live, the day-to-day living, the existence of Calvinism. 3 distinct points that relate, I think, to the novel and the central metaphor of the river. So, the doctrine of providence. First of all, I'm quoting from the Catechism, the Short Catechism. What are the decrees of God? That's William Blake. William Blake's God. Recognize, I heard somebody say that. Good catch. William Blake. What are the decrees of God? The decrees of God are His eternal purpose according to the counsel of His will, whereby, for His own glory, He hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. I'm sorry, I'm testing. Does the camera follow me? Oh, it does. It can follow me. Hello. I have to walk. What does that mean? Is it clear to you that that statement means that God, yes? God
predicts the future. He knows what is going to happen. He knows what's going to happen because He set it all up.
Okay, so that's I want to press your language a little bit. I think you're correct, but only because you added the last couple words. Ordain. One of the things that Calvinists are very insistent on is that God does not know what's going to happen. God decides what's going to happen. This statement literally means God does everything. And that's really what they mean by it. God does everything. So notice the distinction. We tend to want to say that this doctrine is a doctrine where God knows what's going to happen, that He predicts what's going to happen. Calvin himself was very, very clear, and in his 2,000-page book, the first 500 pages are devoted to explaining and arguing this, that it doesn't make any sense that God knows the future unless God does the future. God acts actively, directly. To say, for a Calvinist, to say God allows things to happen or knows that things are going to happen is to speak blasphemy. God is not that weak. That's human weakness. God is omnipotent, and that necessarily entails that God does everything. And do Calvinists therefore mean that every young family that's offed by a drunk driver, God did that? Yes, they do. They mean that God does everything. That's the doctrine of providence. Here, another quote from the Catechism. What are the works of God's providence? This is the word that's used, providence. Sometimes I ask students in class what they think providence means, and I often get people answering back that providence is the idea that things happen by chance. Right? That's the exact opposite of what providence means. Yes? It is that too, yes. It is a town in Rhode Island. The town in Rhode Island is named by good Calvinists, and they mean providence, right? The works of God's providence, God's works of providence are His most holy, wise, and powerful preserving and governing all His creatures and all their actions. So from a Calvinist perspective, you can guess this answer, right? Who are God's creatures? Everybody, right? Not just Christians, not just believers, not just members of the community. God's creatures are every absolutely last living thing. Every ant, every slug, every snail is God's creature, and God governs, God preserves and governs all their actions. That's what providence means. So here is where we come to our first glimpse of grace, what grace means. Grace, as a theological concept in Calvinism, defined as it is, if you look in a dictionary, especially a theological dictionary, which is defining religiously important words from the Bible and words from theology, the typical definition of grace is unmerited or undeserved favor. Grace is stuff that you get that's positive and good that you do not deserve and did not earn. The not deserving and not earning is the essential part of it, the essential ingredient. To have grace, the Greek word is charis. Oh, in the transfer, I typed that in Greek. My Greek font didn't transfer to this system. Charis is the Greek word. That's how you say it, charis. And we get our word grace directly from the Greek word charis. And charis in Greek meant gift, a gift. Something you do not earn, you didn't work to pay for, you don't deserve. It's given to you freely. And it's given as a gift, and so on, right? All that stuff that I just said. Here's something, one of the statements in the novel that stands out to me that I find most interesting and very telling is this statement. The author says, Paul nearly always had a story to tell in which he was the leading character, but not a hero. He's referring in the novel to Paul telling stories, right? He's telling stories at a bar. He's telling stories to impress women, try to get them into bed, and the various things that Paul does in the novel. And he describes Paul as this way, as being adept at telling stories in which he was the leading character. It's about his adventures, but he's not the hero. And the thing that's interesting about that is that somebody from the background who is saturated in the culture, the religious culture that I'm talking about, would, I think, recognize in this statement the meaning that the hero of every story is God, is God's will, God's grace, right? Or if you prefer, Jesus could be the hero of the story. The human character, the human leading character is not the hero. And so this is one of the ways in which the author communicates the idea, the Calvinistic idea of grace. So Now we move to Calvinist soteriology, the Calvinist doctrine of salvation. Salvation. How do you get saved? What's salvation about? Sin, salvation. Jesus saves. Jesus saves from what? How do you get saved by Jesus? What does Jesus save us These are the questions, right? What is salvation? And Calvinistic salvation has, for several centuries now, been taught to people in the form of the acronym TULIP. TULIP. T-U-L-I-P. T stands for total depravity. Total depravity, which means that human beings are totally depraved. All human beings are absolutely evil and completely sinful to their core and incapable of performing any single act of good. Calvin put it this way, that a human person, all human persons, as a result of the fall, Adam and Eve in the garden, that whole business, as a result of the fall, all human persons are not capable of ever once having a pure thought or word or action that is completely good. Sin permeates our being down to the core of our nature. We are totally depraved. To quote the Catechism, the fall brought mankind into an estate of sin and misery. The sinfulness, and that's answer 17. Answer 18 says, the sinfulness of that estate consists in the corruption of his whole nature, which is commonly called original sin. This is what Calvinists mean by original sin. Adam and Eve were made with freedom of will and goodness. As soon as Adam bit into the fruit, the forbidden fruit, then all human beings from then on are depraved, are completely in a state of misery and sin and depraved. In a damn mess is how the novel puts it. I'm going to quote the novel on the next slide, illustrating all the TULIP points. U stands for unconditional election. Humans are not capable of choosing good, of believing in Jesus and being good Christians, not capable of it. Unconditional election is also known as predestination. And the Catechism says, God, having out of his mere good pleasure from all eternity elected some to everlasting life, did enter into a covenant of grace to deliver them out of the estate of sin and misery and to bring them into an estate of salvation by a Redeemer. Right? Do you get what this means? This means that God decides who is saved, who believes in Jesus and becomes a Christian, and who doesn't. And they do according to what God decides, because they're incapable of doing it themselves. So everyone who becomes a Christian and goes to heaven, God preordains that. God not just knows it, but decides it and makes it happen. What this doesn't state the negative side of it. God decides who goes to hell. And he sends them there without respect to their choice or anything that they've done. Right? So what do you do to earn salvation? What do you do to merit salvation? Nothing. You do absolutely nothing. You can do absolutely nothing. That's why it's called grace, because God gives it to you of his free will. And logically, Calvin would say, logically, if God has free will, you do not and cannot. This is a system, it's hard to wrap one's mind around. This is a system of absolute determinism. Everything that happens, everything you think, feel, say, and do, God decided that you would think, feel, say, and do. You think that you chose of your own freedom to buy a yellow car instead of a red car. But you didn't. God determined that from all eternity. That's what Calvinism says. TULIP. Oops, I got these out of order. The L stands for limited atonement. The I stands for irresistible grace. Irresistible grace is that when God's grace acts on you, you can't resist it. You can't say no to God. It's not possible. God's will prevails. What God wills happens, period, including what God wills for you to think and to feel. To quote the Catechism, the Spirit applieth to us redemption purchased by Christ by working faith in us and thereby uniting us to Christ in our effectual calling. What that means, that fancy Elizabethan English, means that God decides you are going to be saved, not you, but you, and then God gives you the grace and you are enlightened. You suddenly believe. You come to an understanding of the gospel and you embrace it, and it's applied to you by God. You are a passive recipient. You do nothing. It is a spectator sport. You have no contribution to make at all. Limited atonement is the doctrine that Jesus died not for the sins of the whole world, but for only the elect that God has chosen to be saved. And the perseverance of saints is, the screen doesn't go down far enough. The perseverance of saints, I have a quote down there, but it's not coming up, and the quote says this: the perseverance of the saints is that if God has chosen you to be saved, there's nothing you can do against that, and you will ultimately last to the end. In a way, you don't know who's saved and who's not till they die, right? But those who are truly saved, that is, those who are truly chosen by God, who are truly elect, will last in the faith, will express the faith, keep believing, keep going to church, keep doing the stuff until they die. And that is what perseverance means. That if you are truly elect, then you will last to the end. If you stop believing and stop going to church before you die, and then you die and you decided to be a Buddhist, then in this scheme, what does that mean for your salvation? It means you were never saved in the first place. It means that it was an aberration, a temporary show that you put on that God did for some reason. But you were never saved in the first place if you don't last till the end of your life. Right? Paul in the novel, where is he in this scheme? I submit to you, he's absolutely clearly in heaven. He's clearly saved. Notice what the novel says of them, the brothers. Did they ever miss church? Didn't matter how hungover they were. And getting drunk and street fighting and having sex with prostitutes, does that keep you from salvation? Absolutely not. No, it has nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter at all. Believing and showing up to church is how you show, how you indicate, give evidence that you are elect. And within the scheme of Calvinism, the brothers are saved. And Paul, though he dies in a drunken street fighting brawl, goes to heaven. Okay, so here's a couple of quotes from the novel itself that illustrates how the tulip is expressed in the novel. Man by nature is a damn mess. He says that on page 1, on page 2, on page 3, and on page 4, right? By nature is a damn mess. I'm sorry, that's not a Montana accent, is it? Only by picking up God's rhythms were we able to regain power and beauty. God's rhythms, right? Until man is redeemed, he will always take a fly rod too far back, just as natural man always overswings with an axe or golf club and loses all of his power somewhere in the air. What does that mean? Given what I've told you about Calvinism, what does that mean? We can come back and talk about it in a little bit. But he makes much of this, the fly fishing part, right? I don't fish myself. I've tried, and I just can't like it. I've tried to like it, and I just can't make myself like it. But I get the idea, I think, from other hobbies and habits and skills that I have. He makes much of this point that skill in fishing is about control and restraint, right? Everything happens, what does he say, between 2 and 10? Yeah, 2 and 10. 4 moves, 2 and 10. And notice what he's saying here is that if you're trying too hard, you're not getting it. You don't succeed. You don't get the fish. You're not good at it with too much effort. And that illustrates what Calvinists say about grace, what the grace of God means. It's not about you. It's not about your effort. Exerting effort doesn't please God and doesn't get you saved. It doesn't get you anywhere with God. Restraint and accepting of God's rhythm, God's grace, God's gift is how you get there, right? And so I think that tulip point is in that line, that idea in the novel. My father was very sure about certain matters pertaining to the universe. To him, all good things, trout as well as eternal salvation, come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy, right? So here's another aspect of Calvinism. When you read Calvin's tome, his systematic theological tome, he talks about how grace is both easy and hard. It's both the easiest thing and the hardest thing at the same time, right? And the way that Paul is described in the novel, his prowess at fishing, the way he can straddle the rocks and the beauty. You know that one of the things that's really touching about the novel is that he's such an artist with fly fishing that passers-by just stop and are stunned. They're stopped in their tracks to watch him because he's such an artist. But the secret of his artistry is his being in tune with the ease and the control with which good fly fishing takes place, right? Whereas other people extend themselves too much and try too hard. In the New Testament, there's a lot of talk about how we're saved by grace and not by works, right? And one of the things that Calvin said, explaining grace, what he meant by grace is that if God rewards you with heaven as a reward for your believing, in other words, you believe and God responds to your belief by giving you heaven, then you're saved by works. You're saved by your merit. God is responding to you. And from a Calvinist point of view, that is an extremely improper thing to say about God. It's all got to initiate with God. So God is the actor, and you are simply the receiver in this. So the way that usually most Christians probably think of it, that you believe and you're saved because you believe, Calvinists would say is blasphemy. It's a terribly and deceptively wrong way of describing it. And in fact, it might indicate, if you say it that way, it might indicate you're not saved at all, unless you understand correctly that first God saves you, then you believe. God saving you is first. God regenerating you, you being born again, is first. And that happens to you without your will, without your permission, without anything to do with you. So the river is God's grace. The river is powerful. The river is majestic. The river also doesn't adjust to people. The river doesn't care or worry about people's feelings or people getting in the way. And I think the river in this novel, is a metaphor for what Calvinists mean by God's decree or God's grace. Here's a passage where the narrator in the novel is sitting contemplating the river. And he says this. I love this passage. He sat there and forgot until what remained was the river that went by. And I who watched. The river went by, I watched, right? That's a great emblem of the Calvinist view of God's grace. I watch. That's all I do. And it does all the action. On the river, the heat mirages danced with each other, and then they danced through each other, and then they joined hands and danced around each other. Eventually, the watcher joined the river, and there was only one of us. I believe it was the river, right? The river subsumes the watcher. The watcher eventually blends in the river. That's almost a little Buddhist-ish. The That's almost a concept that you find in Buddhism and in some texts in Hinduism, where the ultimate goal is a personal extinction, the extinction of the self in Brahman, right? That's a Hindu idea. But here, in this Calvinist situation, they mean God here. They mean the biblical God as the one ultimate reality that you, as an individual, are being subsumed into and losing your consciousness of selfhood. And Paul, I think, is the human in a state of grace. Right? Now, Paul is a character. As you read the novel, I think that you're meant to. I know, certainly I did. As you read the character Paul, you appreciate his prowess, even though I don't fly fish and I know nothing about it. I come to find it beautiful just because of the way it's described and the way he can do it. But then he's got this dark side, this shadow side. He fly fishes beautifully, and he goes to church. He never misses church, and he's never. We are told this of Paul, that the two things that he's never late for. He not only doesn't fail to show up, but he's never late, is church and fly fishing, right? But then he's got this shadow side. He's out getting drunk. Sometimes he's drinking copiously at early times in the morning. And he's got addictions. He's got human frailings. He's compelled to get drunk and go out to bars and land in bed with strange women and get into fights and knife fights and stuff like that. And you're always rooting for him. All the characters. Think of how all of the human characters at one point say, "God, I wish I could help him." How do you help him? What do you do for him? I don't know what to do for him. I don't know what to say to him. And his brother kind of hints, is a little afraid to say anything too confrontational, to confront him too directly, kind of dances around it. The father and the narrating brother have this conversation. I don't know what to do for him. I wish I could do something. I wish I could save that part of his life, right? And the way, as someone steeped in Calvinism, I'm not a Calvinist anymore, by the way. But as someone who lived in Calvinism for a period of time, what it feels to me to read this novel and to read the character of Paul is that I feel like the author is communicating the absolute inevitability of his end. Right? The entire thing is determined, fixed, and inevitable. There is nothing you can do about it. It's just going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And when and how is God's decree. God has already decided that it's going to happen. Right? And that is a condition, from the Calvinist point of view, of a state of grace. We are sinners. From a Calvinist point of view, we are sinners saved by grace. You don't judge someone. You don't judge someone's spiritual condition by how clean and neat they are, by how disciplined they are, how good they are. In fact, the people that look good, that look morally good, that look like they're moral exemplars, are most likely the people who are going to be in the hottest part of hell. Because that means nothing to God, and it has no reference to God's grace. God's grace is for sinners, right? The Catechism, the majority of the Catechism, the short Catechism, the majority of pages is devoted to explicating the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments. How we obey them, how we should live, how we're supposed to get along through life, one day at a time. And one of the statements that it makes is this. In question number 82, it says, Is any man able perfectly to keep the commandments of God? It asks. And the answer is no. No mere man since the fall is able in this life to perfectly keep the commandments of God, but doth daily break them in thought, word, and deed. Right? So a Calvinist ethos is one in which you are expected, if you're a good Calvinist, to pay very careful attention, to read the Bible every day, to go to church and pay very careful attention to what God's will is, what God commands, and to try your best to do it, and to know that you will never succeed, and to accept that you'll never succeed, and just keep on living in grace. Living on grace means being forgiven and accepting your forgiveness and knowing that you're forgiven. Have you ever seen the bumper sticker, Christians aren't perfect, just forgiven? Seems kind of a cop-out to me. Now, right, it seems like it's kind of a cop-out. But that's a good Calvinist slogan. You don't judge people by what they do. A person could be a derelict crack whore and be in a complete and perfect state of grace. Right? And so this is my kind of summary of what I think of the character of Paul. Paul combines the special grace of being the best fly fisherman, an artist that inspires awe and halts passers-by in their tracks with wonder, and a hopelessly addicted human whom his loved ones are helpless to help. His untimely street-fighting, drunken death is anticipated from page 1 as if a solemn decree from the providence of God that those who love him can only watch in solemn silence. People just watch him happen, and it's sad. It's sad that when suddenly, all of a sudden, when I turned the page and he dies, I didn't see the movie, by the way, and I've never seen the movie. And now that I've read the book a couple times, I don't want to. I don't plan to. Someone may talk me out of that. I don't know. But when every time, virtually every time, a movie is based on a work of fiction, yeah, okay. So anyway, but when I, it's like when I turned the page and found out Paul's dead. I don't know if you read it like I did, but I felt, I knew that was coming. I knew it was coming, but it still hurt. It still stabbed me. But it was inevitable. It had to happen. And in fact, the first page of the novel adumbrates it, right? And I think that feeling that it's inevitable is an expression of Calvinist worldview, of Calvinist ethos. Just one more little point, and my Greek font didn't work. I had the text typed out in Greek here, but here's a New Testament. The Father. Did you notice? Did you catch? Did anybody notice? Was anybody bewildered by the section toward the end of the novel, and then the novel ends with the Father in his Greek New Testament and the discussion of the Word. What is first, the Word or the water? And they talk about what is beneath. The water is like primal. It comes off the glaciers. It goes deep in the evolution of the world, and it's primal and fundamental and foundational. And then the Father introduces the thought, the water is not primal, but underneath it is the Word. And then they argue about that. And this is the closing statement of the novel, the very last statement. Now, he's talking about the people who have died, and he says, eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over the rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by waters, right? So here he picks up, this is the image that he closes the book with, that the waters, the majestic waters, the powerful river flowing as it does, the Blackfoot, straight off the glacier, straight through western Montana, but under it is Word, right? And that all of that is a reference and a meditation to the opening line of the Gospel of John. Sorry, I'm not ready for that. The Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. This is the opening statement of the fourth Gospel in the New Testament. Enarche ein hologos, kai hologos pros ton theon, kai theon ein hologos. That's Greek. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, right? So God's decree, the Word, the thought, is prior. And out of that comes the river, right? And the river is, remember the line, he says, still early in the novel, he says that a human life, is more like a river than a book, right? The river is about the flow of life, which is all right in God's decree. The river is God's decree and the life that it creates. And the Word is prior to that and its source, right? So, and that's the Blackfoot. That is the Blackfoot in Montana. It's not a section that I can see Paul fly fishing on, but maybe, I don't know. But that is the Blackfoot. Okay.
Is this just a year ago or so? I mean, real recent.
It's a recent picture. Right. So, yeah, drought. Yeah. Okay. So it's about 8 till. Questions? Can we have lights? Lights, camera, action. Questions or reactions?
Is it an issue in Calvinism, since everything's preordained, that you can't really have an ethics? You can't have moral prescriptions?
It is an issue. Everything Calvinists, if you go into a Calvinist coven, I'm going to ironically and humorously use that word. If you go into a Calvinist, Elliot's question for everybody was, is it a Calvinist issue that you can have moral precepts at all, moral dictates, since everything is ordained? And everything that relates to human behavior is debated in Calvinism. Similarly, Calvinists debate whether prayer means anything. Right? That's one of the first things that if people, when Christians inside of a Christian community are confronted with Calvinism, one of the first things they ask is, well, why should I pray? Everything's already determined, and what I pray for changes nothing. So why should I pray? And the answer back, right, and you might anticipate this, right? The answer to any such question is, well, God ordained that there should be moral precepts and that people should obey them or not, and try to obey them or not. And that's all part of God's decree, right? And so the thing that really operates in a moment-by-moment living situation for a Calvinist is, the most important question for me is, am I saved? Am I one of the elect? And I can never know that infallibly, but I can reassure myself by what I do. If I go to church and I'm faithful going to church and I like going to church, that is evidence to me that I am elect, that I'm one of the chosen. So I'm going to generate that evidence as much as I can, right? And notice that one of the things that the Catechism emphasizes is that it's far more important to show that you're elect by going to church, listening to the preaching of the Word. In Calvinist churches, that's the most important thing. Listening to the preaching of the Word. As long as you get to church and listen to the preaching of the Word, get yourself to church and read your Bible and keep believing in Jesus, then that is a good indication that you're saved. Doing good things, refraining from littering, not wasting water in the shower, recycling, remembering your canvas bags when you go to the grocery store. Doing good things is also good. That's good. A Calvinist would say, yeah, you should remember your canvas bags. You should recycle your plastic. But if you don't, that's not a very good indicator. But if you skip church for a month, you're in dangerous territory, right? And so, as a determinist system, it's always controversial. Calvinists often argue. You'll find Calvinists themselves who raise the problem and then try to answer it. One of the biggest problems in Calvinism is the offering of the gospel sincere? Can you sincerely offer to someone, hey, come and be a Christian and be saved? God loves you and offers a wonderful plan for your life, like the people on the street, across the street do, right? God loves you, come and be saved. Is that genuine? Because in point of fact, from a Calvinist point of view, you don't know if they're saved. You don't know if they're elect. So should you offer everybody, should you offer people in general the gospel? And the answer is yes, you should, because God has commanded it and decreed that you should. But when you do, there's always a qualification, a caveat. Because some of the people that you're inviting to be saved, might have been chosen by God for damnation. And Calvin loves to say in his systematic theology that the people who fry in hell will praise God for frying them in hell for his glory. How do you like that? Is that good? Isn't that good stuff? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder though if Norman, the son that writes the book, really was a Calvinist in the footsteps of his father. You know.
Say again?
Well, I wonder if the writer of the book, Norman, the son, actually followed Presbyterianism the way his father did. You did hint
Right.
that there was a kind of Buddhism.
Right. No, I completely agree. I don't think that the author, that Norman McLean, is a strict doctrinaire Calvinist. I don't think so at all. Thanks for saying that, because I don't mean to imply that I think that that's what he's doing. I just think that he's using the basic tenets of Calvinism as something that informs his metaphors. But I don't think he's all there, and I think that he incorporates other things. Like I did mention, some of it sounds kind of Buddhist. Yeah.
Also, it said in the book there that toward the beginning that God is love is on the walls of the church.
Right.
But it only in our family. We think of it as applying to our family, but otherwise, well, I mean.
Right. And that actually illustrates the Calvinist ethos, right? We say God is love, and the church, the marquee says God is love, God loves everybody, but we know he loves us, not everybody, right? Yeah.
So in terms of the Calvinism, how we can recognize to be saved? How we can recognize who are be saved?
Who is saved?
Who are? Yeah,
How do we
who is-
recognize?
Who is? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Two more questions.
Who? How do you know if somebody's saved? How do you recognize them?
Right. Who's gonna recognize or
Uh-huh.
to who are going to be saved?
Uh-huh.
And that is first question. And why are you interested in Calvinism? And
Why am I interested in Calvinism?
yeah. And third one is who are the famous people who affect in the society in the United States?
Who are the?
Who has a like a very like a faith for the Calvinism?
In the United States. Who are the Calvinists in the United States?
Right.
Okay, so good. Three great questions. So the first question is, you cannot recognize someone who is saved by looking at them. The Calvin, one of the most important points of Calvin's theology and how it differed from Catholic theology is that Catholic theology refers to the visible church. And Calvin said, there is no visible church. The visible church is false church. Any church that you can see, that you can recognize by looking at it, is false. The true church is invisible. You can't see it, you can never see it. So Calvin made that a very pointed point, sorry for that redundancy, in his doctrine that the true church is invisible. So you shouldn't be able to recognize it. So Calvin, this is a disquieting thought that Calvin and Calvinists espouse, that if you go into any given church, you're looking at a bunch of people who are, probably most of them are going to hell. And you don't know which ones. That's not for you to know. You can't possibly know that. But you just know in general that most people do go to hell. And these people aren't necessarily any more likely to be saved, to be one of the elect, than people out in the street. So you don't know. The second the second thing is I got into Calvinism. I gained an interest in Calvinism and started studying it when I was, I joined a Pentecostal church when I was 17. I was a born-again teenager, Pentecostal. And in this Christian community that I was in, I had a friend who studied Calvinism and became a Calvinist, and he came to me and persuaded me. He argued for me from the Bible, to me from the Bible, that Calvinism was the correct way to understand the Bible, that it was what the Bible taught. And I was persuaded by that. And so I adopted it, and I've done this several times in my life, where my default position, when I hear something new and it seems persuasive, the logic seems tight, I accept it first and then prove it wrong. And that's exactly what I did. And I lived in it. I lived inside Calvinism for 5 years. And gradually I worked through some of the problems, some of the intellectual problems, some of the biblical problems. And eventually I got over it. Eventually I decided, I don't want to do this anymore. I think it's, can I say this on camera? I think that it's not true anymore. But I lived in it and I worked through it. I was one of the few people I knew who professed to be a Calvinist and actually read Calvin's entire 2,000-page tome all the way through and then again. And I studied all the catechisms and the theologians and so on. And gradually I just dropped it. I just thought, I don't believe this anymore, right? And in the United States, there are the famous, okay, I don't know, Terry Jones, do you know who Terry Jones is? Terry Jones is the pastor in Florida, I think he's in Florida, who has a very small congregation, but he's famous to the point where Barack Obama called him his home phone and had a conversation with him. Terry Jones, anyone? Terry Jones is the guy who announced to the world that he was going to gather and burn Qurans, right? And set the world on fire. He was going to set the world on fire by burning the Quran and upsetting Muslims and hopefully inciting them to riot. Terry Jones, you can go on YouTube. If you Google Terry Jones, you can go on YouTube and you can see a video of Terry Jones giving a Sunday school lesson to his congregation with the tulip, right? You can see him lecturing on the tulip. So he's a Calvinist, and he's kind of famous, or infamous is maybe a little bit more accurate. There are still theologians. I did a master's degree at a theological school where these are big names to in the Christian theological world that you probably wouldn't recognize. But Colin Brown is an eminent scholar, the author of 30 books, and he's retired now, but he's a major theologian. And I had classes with him. I had master's level seminars with him, and he's a Calvinist theologian. There are Calvinists around. Calvinism is not a very widespread or majority view anymore, or in American Christianity. But there are prominent Calvinists. I don't offhand know of any movie stars that are Calvinists. Right? There are various movie stars that espouse various. Mel Gibson famously is a Catholic of a certain kind, and but there are Calvinists around. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, okay. Good.
Calvinism, is it, I understand it's the root of Presbyterian Church.
Right.
But as we know it today, is it still considered Calvinism?
Yeah, most Presbyterians, that's a good question. And the answer is most Presbyterians don't even know who Calvin is, right? They have long kind of dropped it and moved on from it. Most Presbyterian pastors will have had to have read Calvin. They will have been assigned to have read Calvin in seminary, right? They will have had lectures on him, but they don't necessarily, he's kind of a historical relic. And most average members of the congregation of a Presbyterian church will have no idea.
The
Well,
reason I asked is my wife and I are doing genealogy. We found a relative, very famous relative, Sir Thomas More.
oh,
And we actually have several copies of Utopia.
uh-huh.
However, I can't read it. It's almost impossible.
Right.
So I'm wondering how how that was written, Calvinism, because you said you read the original manuscript, I guess, of the book.
Yeah,
Because it's such a bizarre English, it's really hard to understand.
yeah. You have to. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you have to really be practiced at it. Yeah. I mean, it would be good to. I don't know if we have any classes that would help, but you have to study that old English and kind of get acquainted with its weirdnesses, and also there are for More's Utopia. I'm pretty sure that there are versions that you can get that have paraphrases or are translated, right? I mean, you can get Shakespeare and Milton. You can get translated, right? And so that you might do that and get a kind of a book that gives you a pony, right? And read them side by side, and then that helps you kind of get what he's on about. Yeah. Okay.
I just want to say that, look, I was a member of the Presbyterian Church for a lot of years, and since have dropped in, not a part of that at all.
Right.
But it has changed a lot. There are some of the things you mentioned, though, that are, oh yeah, that sounds
Right.
like the Calvinist
Right.
beginnings. But I mean, that nowadays you cannot say that that's, it's not the same at all, but
Right.
it has similarities.
Right.
Similarities.
You know,
its origins.
one of the oddest things to me is that a place where Calvinists are fairly still well entrenched and well represented in academic institutions is the Netherlands. Holland, the Netherlands, was a major Calvinist place, and that's, of course, the source of the founding of the Republic of South Africa. The Republic of South Africa was founded by Dutch Calvinists, right? And so, I mean, that's kind of a nasty aspect of it. Calvin's Geneva also is a little bit of a totalitarian theocracy. It's kind of nasty. Calvin, thanks to Max Weber, the famous sociologist, Calvin gets credit for being in tune with the spirit of capitalism. But I just don't see that. Calvin's experiment in Geneva was a socialist one. So anyway, but yes, many people have dropped it, and the people that I know that want theology degrees and they want to study under Calvinists, they go to either Holland or they go to Scotland. You can still get a good Calvinist theological education at St. Andrews University in Scotland. Yeah. Huh? Oh, really? Okay, well, sorry, camera. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I think we're done. Thank you.